Hello, and welcome to Module 7, The Power of Transparency, exploring the significance of the Freedom of Information Act, a key piece of legislation that allows you to access government files and data that you've paid for. The objectives of this module are to understand the principles of the Freedom of Information Act, to know how to put together a FOIA to get the information back that you desire, and to know when and how to request fee variances for FOIA requests. A couple of the key words that we will address today: Freedom of Information Act, public records, open government, transparency, and fee waivers. The Freedom of Information Act is a cornerstone of our democratic process. Data collected by the federal government is by law open to the public, excluding data legally protected like HIPAA. Knowing how to access agency files can be critical to understanding an issue or issues plaguing your community. All of the data the government collects is taxpayer-funded data. You pay for it, you can use it. Accessing it can be a little bit tricky, but hopefully as you go through this module, you will understand not only how to access it, but how to possibly not pay for that access. What is the Freedom of Information Act? FOIA is a federal law that allows individuals to request and obtain records from the federal agencies, promoting governance and citizen engagement. The Freedom of Information Act emerged from a growing demand for government transparency in the U.S. This was specifically over the Cold War and the Nixon era. Public pressures mounted in the early 1900s, fueled by concerns over secrecy during wars and social unrest. Congressman John Moss championed FOIA legislation in the 50s and 60s, a time marked by Cold War anxieties. Despite initial limitations, FOIA was signed in 1966. The Watergate scandal in 1974 led to amendments strengthening the act. Today, the digital age presents both challenges and opportunities for FOIA, with debates continuing about balancing transparency with national security and privacy. Knowing how to access and how to use the Freedom of Information Act is critical to receiving emails, collected data, conversations back and forth between agencies and developers, for example. All of this is accessible as long as it is not one of the few areas of data that's not accessible, like HIPAA, which would be your medical records. The key provisions of the Freedom of Information Act are a presumption of openness. That means that unless it is specifically called out as a piece of data that should not be allowed to be accessed by the public, it should be open to the public. That the public has a right to request. FOIA grants any person the legal right to submit a request for access to agency records. This right applies to U.S. citizens and non-citizens alike. So it does not matter who you are, you should be able to submit a FOIA into the right agency, and they will give you the information back in a timely manner. No one will ever ask for your citizen status or any personal information about you at all. In fact, if that does happen, it is being done illegally. It should be a huge red flag. Mandatory timelines. FOIA sets deadlines for agencies to respond to information requests. So there are a series of triggers and timelines that are scheduled once you submit a FOIA. It is usually within 72 hours you need a response. That response usually includes a timeline that it will take them to review and pull files. But that should be within a 30-day time period, if not less. It depends on the volume you're asking for. It depends on the specificity of your request itself. It is always best to be as specific as possible. That will expedite the process and also keep the cost down. The appeals process. If an agency denies a FOIA request in full or part, the requester has the right to appeal the decision. So if you apply for Freedom of Information Act request on a new proposed coal plant, for example, that's coming into your neighborhood, you receive the records back, and there are a tremendous amount of things that are redacted because of trade secrets or because of Department of Energy information. You have the ability and the right to appeal that process to try and get those files unredacted. This is a very common procedure when you are dealing with Department of Energy, Department of Defense, or with human health. All three of those tend to be places where you'll see quite a bit redacted. The other, which I would urge you to push back on, would be trade secrets. So a lot of times companies are able to not provide full information about the chemicals they're using or their processes or the amount of those chemicals, claiming trade secrets. Trade secrets is how we got into the very large, overwhelming issue of PFAS, which are the forever chemicals that are located in everybody's body now and throughout our environment. A big problem was that the federal government allowed, under the label of trade secrets, for the companies creating these materials to never disclose fully what they were. Now we are dealing with an overwhelming contamination crisis throughout the United States that threatens not only the health of our citizens, but the vitality of our water resources. So if you run into trade secrets, I would urge you to push back on that as much as possible, because there might be some very valuable information about contamination or about potential impacts to your community that the government would otherwise try to keep back. Fees. Agencies can charge fees to process FOIA requests. However, there are waivers available for requesters who demonstrate a significant public interest in the information. I would assume that if you are taking this class, you are working on behest of the public interest. So, in most situations, you'll see examples down the road a little bit, you should be requiring a fee request. It can become quite expensive quickly for a FOIA. You're spending money on the time that the staffer is using to pull the files to do the original search. You are paying money for all of the data that gets downloaded in the files, and the time for any other staff member of another department within that agency that has to spend time to pull that data in. So if you are in fact working on behest of the public interest, you should request a variance of those fees because, like I said, they can become pretty expensive pretty quickly. All right, there are 9 FOIA exemption categories, so 9 places where you cannot get data from the federal government. The information the agencies can withhold from disclosure: classified national security information, so Department of Defense can be very difficult to get information out of. Again, this is another one where if you believe there is contamination from a Department of Defense site, a fort, I would urge you, if you get redacted information back that includes stuff that you might need or that would help you understand the current situation, push back on that, specifically with contamination issues. Internal agency communications that are deliberative or pre-decisional in nature. So the agencies do not have to turn over to you emails or conversations before a permitting process that explains their thought process in making those decisions. Sometimes that information is included in your file automatically, but they do not have to give that information to you. Information that could harm an individual's privacy. A lot of times when you get files back in, some of the individuals that may have been involved with the case or an issue will be redacted out. If Again, this is a situation where if that information is something that helps you fully understand in a meaningful way, then push back on that. If you believe that that individual's contact information or privacy is somehow relevant to the case or the issue that you're working on. Law enforcement records that can interfere with an investigation. Now, this is incredibly important. Any agency with an ongoing enforcement action will not release any of the records, will not talk to you about that ongoing enforcement action until they've made a decision. So that means if you've had an oil spill next to your house and you're trying to find out information and they're still working on going after the person that was responsible for the oil spill, and you send a FOIA in, you are not going to get any records back. It is always wise, if you are dealing with a situation like that, to find out who is the staffer that is working on that issue and contact them directly to figure out whether or not those files are available and what you can ask for, what they can provide, and what not. A lot of times you will find these staffers are very willing and want to help you. You just need to know how to have just need to reach out, have a conversation. Trade secrets are commercially valuable information. So we just discussed that. So that is how we got into this PFAS issue. The fact is that a lot of our industries are allowed to keep huge secrets back in how they operate, what they're doing, what kind of chemicals they're using, and the impacts, claiming trade secrets. I worked on a chlorine plant many years ago that used a huge amount of mercury in its process. And they had a lot of fugitive emissions. So their permit said that they were only emitting 17 pounds of mercury, which by the way is too much. But in fact, their fugitive emissions were over 700 pounds every single year. Now, they were able to report the mercury use as an entire industry, chlorine industry, not individual municipality or individual corporations. They knew exactly how much mercury they were using. They were using it because they have to buy it, right? So they know how much they had, they know how much they're left over with. However, the fact that they didn't have to release that into, to communicate that out to the public became a very big issue, because there were many people harmed by the mercury coming from this facility, and nobody really knew the volume, the vast volume of mercury that was moving through. So again, this is one, push back on the trade secrets or commercially viable information as much as you possibly can. Certain internal agency personnel in medical files, I would be very surprised if you got personnel or any kind of medical files on an internal staff agency individual. That's not something that I see very often. Information that could interfere with financial institutions' regulations. So they are not going to give you access to information that will harm our banking institutions or those that are regulating our banking institutions. They'll hold that information back. And then geological and geophysical information on energy resources. Department of Energy gets a big buy when it comes to FOIA. It is a really interesting space where you have private companies, you have quasi-private companies, and you have the government all really working very closely together and trying to regulate. So the government is working and regulating these folks at the same time. But allows them a vast amount of information that they don't have to release. So again, that's one that push back as much as you can. These FOIA exemption categories mean that they can redact this information. It doesn't mean that they have to. So if you find yourself in a challenge, push back as much as possible and see how much data you can actually get. Never hurts to ask. And again, you have the right to this information. So if for some reason you reach out and you are not getting this information, you should call the Department of Justice. You should actually push back. Freedom of Information Act is a cornerstone to good journalism. It's a cornerstone to good citizen advocacy, and it's your right. You have the right to civil discourse. You have the right to hold your officials accountable. You have a right to the data that you are paying for as a U.S. citizen. So please don't let anybody tell you no, unless you are falling under those exemption categories, and even sometimes then, push to get this data. It is an information. It's yours, and you have every right to access it. All right, some quick ways that the Freedom of Information Act impacts our communities. It has significant impact on the United States, fostering transparency, accountability, and public participation in government. Here is a breakdown of its key effects. It increases transparency. It allows the citizens to see what their government is doing, holding officials accountable for their decisions and actions. It empowers the public. Armed with information obtained through FOIA requests, citizens can become more informed participants in their democracy. Journalistic investigation. FOIAs are used constantly by journalists to uncover wrongdoings, expose government misconduct, understand what the government is up to, and shed light on important stories. The Freedom of Information Act is a cornerstone of journalistic investigations. In fact, I would say that probably most journalists learning how to do a FOIA is pretty much out the gate. Public policy development. Access to government data through FOIA allows researchers, analysts, and policymakers to gain insights and inform better policy decisions. It is very rare that you will deal with a situation that is the first time that anything has been tried. If you have a new project, or you have something you want information about that has been done in another state, it's been done in another part of the United States, you can FOIA for that information in the other part of the United States. It will help you understand more what's going on. And then accountability and oversight. FOIA empowers watchdog organizations and advocacy groups to monitor government activities and ensure compliance with law and regulation. Accountability is huge. Had we been more aggressive about the PFAS situation earlier, maybe DuPont would have not been contaminating us so heavily since the 70s. But that accountability, we need advocacy organizations like hopefully the advocacy work that you are doing, and it is critical that you are able to access and monitor what the government is up to, because behind closed doors is not the way that the government should operate. You have a right to access this information. You should access this information. And I'll give you a good example. You might find, if you were to send in a Freedom of Information Act of the daily monitoring records of a facility, that it has in fact been over applying or exceeding its permit for 3 years in a row, and despite that has never been charged once, or there's never been an enforcement action. That would be a situation where you could use that information to really push on the government to do its job. But without that information, you might not know that that situation exists. Just following up a little bit, accountability and transparency is key to having a healthy government that is watched over by the people, so that it is not exploitative of the people. All right, there are a couple of challenges and limitations to FOIA that you should be aware of. Agencies, like we talked about, can block certain secret information, and they may take out parts of documents that might be confusing. You could get a document back. Oftentimes when I've seen this, it's actually not come from the federal government. It's been local, more community, a lot of redacted, huge amounts of redacted information. Again, if you read through that and you think that it is not truly reflective, or is not, they're redacting more than what you think is allowed based on what we've talked about today, push back. You have the right to appeal and to ask for that data to be disclosed. Getting information through FOIA can be a pain. It can take a lot of time. It can cost money, especially if you have to argue to get something. Again, so we're currently just talking about the federal government. States and local governments actually have their own FOIA systems, but it is generally the same process, but it can be incredibly difficult and it can cost a lot of money to get some of these data. Again, as an advocacy group or as a group that is working for the better good of society, you should often be able to ask for variances on those costs. You shouldn't have to pay all of those costs, but even having to pay a portion of them can add up very quickly, especially when you talk about an issue that may have been going on for multiple years. You might end up with pounds worth of documents. The digital age throws another wrench in the works. There's a ton of data out there, and keeping track of it is all tough. So even in the earlier modules, you saw how many different websites you can go to access different government data. And again, most of that was just on the federal level. We didn't really dig into the states much, but there's a massive amount of data out there. It is very disjointed currently. So trying to track and access all of it in some format that is actually able to be understood together can be quite difficult. And then sometimes agencies don't want to tell you what they're up to. Again, getting back to that enforcement action, if you have a facility that has been exceeding its air permit for particulate matter for the last 5 years on a regular basis, reporting back to the government that they have been doing that and have still not gone through an enforcement action, you might find staff that's kind of hesitant to hand that out. And so if that happens, it's probably best to know a lawyer to help you through that process. But try and keep pushing. Again, as a citizen, you have the right to this data. You have an appeals process. Keep pushing. And if they drag their feet, keep their feet to the fire. And there are efforts to fix these problems. People are working on FOIA, again, with this massive amount of data coming online, trying to come up with websites like data.gov that kind of collates everything together. It's getting there, but we're in the digital age and there's a lot of stuff happening very, very quickly. So just keep that in mind. All right, this is an example FOIA format. So this is a letter submitted to NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. It's by the Southern Environmental Law Center. And you can see here that you have the address, and of course you want a nice header on the top, even if it is your own header, formulate something. Your date, how you've sent it in, whether usually we do email and US mail. It's pretty typical to do email. Now keep in mind, a lot of agencies have just a form you fill out online, so that does not apply in this situation. This is if you need to submit a letter. And then what you're referencing. So this is a Freedom of Information Act request about the harbor expansion and a very specific consultation that happened, right? So we have the numbers in there so they know exactly what they're looking for. Dear FOIA officers, pursuant to the Freedom of Information Act, Southern Environmental Law Center hereby requests the following records. And then it lists out very specifically what records we're looking for. And it even goes on to explain maybe where we might find those records. This is the most important part of your letter that you're sending in, whether you're doing it by form or by letter, being as specific as possible about the who, the what, and the where. And you don't have to include the why. Keep that in mind, but you do want to try and cover as much as possible and be specific about what exactly you're looking for. That'll keep your costs down, that'll keep their time down, make it easier on everybody. All right, this is a very important note. The Freedom of Information Act applies only to the federal government. There is no one single law that applies for everybody. There are different names for the types of laws that local governments and states have. Open record laws, sunshine laws. In Georgia, it's called the Georgia Open Records Act. In South Carolina, they call it the Freedom of Information Act. In Georgia, you submit a letter most often to the agencies. In South Carolina, there's a form on the website. It's much more automated. So the requirements of those laws are going to be different. They all tend to have that 3-day response period, but the amount of time that they may have to provide your data back, how they provide it back, and in what where you have to go to get it can change significantly. So some might be able to send you digital files. Some might make you come in and pull the files and copy and take pictures of them yourself. If you end up in that situation where you need to go in, which is likely, to an agency to review those files, downloading the app TurboScan onto your phone will save you a lot of time and money. It is free. You can take a picture of a PDF, you can push them all together, and you can even seamlessly upload it into Google Drive while you're sitting there, and that will save you so much time, and it will also save it as a PDF versus a JPEG, making it much easier for you to automate reading services or being able to organize that data in the future using any artificial intelligence to help you review those records. All right, to find your state or local open records law, you can look at, just Google open records law and your state, or sunshine law. There's the National Freedom of Information Coalition has them also listed. You should format your open records request to a state or a local entity in the same way as you would to the federal government. You just replace who you're sending it to. I will also tell you that if you go in to pull those files and you are sitting there and somebody is standing there watching you the entire time, or you are feeling intimidated, you have the ability and the right to say, "May I please have some space?" In no way, shape, or form should somebody be watching over you as you review these records. You should be provided them in a space like a conference room where you have enough time to work, but are not being intimidated during that process. All right, so we're going to go through a series of videos put forth by the federal government that explain to you how to submit a FOIA. Again, the specifics: who, what, when, and where. The why is not necessary. They don't need to know the why. It's really not their business to know the why, and I would argue that you probably should never disclose the why, because that might slant some of the information you get back. The only situation I could think of that you might want to explain the why if you think it might bring in different agencies than the one that you already know about. So if you're working on an environmental issue and you are concerned that there have been health effects, right? Even though HIPAA's hard to get, you might in that situation explain, "I'm concerned about human health impacts that may have occurred," and to try and get data from a different agency. But even in that situation, oftentimes I would be hesitant to tell them why. Then include the GPS locations, address, permit numbers, or any other identifying features of your subject of interest. The more you're able to give them an idea of what you're looking for, the better the result is going to be when you get it back. All right, understanding the process. So we'll now go through making a FOIA request, and let's see what they have to say.
The Freedom of Information Act, which is commonly known as the FOIA, is a law that gives you the right to access information from the federal government. It's often described as a law that keeps citizens in the know about what their government is doing. Under the FOIA, agencies must release any information that is requested unless that information is protected from disclosure by law. The FOIA also requires that agencies automatically disclose certain information, including frequently requested records. As Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court have all recognized, the FOIA is a vital part of our democracy.
Okay, so the procedures for a FOIA request. To make a FOIA request, you must submit a written request to the relevant federal agency specifying the information sought. Oftentimes, like we mentioned before, if you have something that might include multiple agencies, Hopefully you get a good FOIA officer and they will tell you you might need to submit to this agency as well. You might need to submit to this other location. Following agency guidelines, including identifying the time frame, location, detail of the records, enhance your chance of a successful request. Oftentimes as well, if I am planning on turning in a record that I might end up wanting local information as well, I will decide early on which one I think is the better one to get more information out of effectively. If I, for some reason, think maybe the county or the city might not want to give me some files, I might start with the federal government so that I have evidence of files that may exist, even if it's just an email, so that if I go to the local and they're not providing that information, I can show evidence that it exists and push more to make sure that I get that file made available.
To get information under the FOIA, typically you must make a FOIA request. Now, this is a written request in which you describe the information you want and the format you want it in as much detail as possible. You should be aware that the FOIA does not require agencies to do research for you, to analyze data or answer written questions, or to create records in response to your request. Finally, you should know that the FOIA requires that federal agencies release certain information automatically without the need for you to make a request. So before you send in that FOIA request, it's a good idea to look at agency websites first and see what's already available online.
Okay, we've briefly talked about the costs associated with the FOIA. FOIA requests incur fees based on the process time and the volume of the information requested. First 2 hours of staff time are typically free, but you should be prepared to cover additional costs and consider requesting fee waivers if the information serves the public interest. Usually when we're submitting a letter, we might put in a line that says we will pay for the first $25 worth of effort. Please contact us beyond that time. So you might set a budget in your letter and say, we're requesting a fee waiver, and also if you've spent more than $50, we want to know so that you don't end up with a multiple $1,000 bill.
There's no charge to submit a FOIA request, but in certain instances, full FOIA processing may require a modest charge. Although there's usually no charge for the first 2 hours of search time and the first 100 pages of duplication, agencies do typically charge for the time it takes to search for records or for duplication of those records after this initial allotment runs out. If you are seeking records for commercial use, you will be charged additional fees. Now, that said, you may always include in your request letter a statement limiting the amount that you are willing to pay in fees, or you may request a waiver of fees. Generally, fee waivers are limited to situations in which you can show that the disclosure of the information is in the public interest. That means it's likely to contribute significantly to public understanding of the operations and activities of the government.
All right, we've talked a decent amount about waivers, accessing files for the public good. Public good means you are working on behalf of the community. So that community can be your neighborhood, it can be your street. If you are not trying to get these files for a commercial purpose, right, to make money one way or the other, or to figure out your competition, you're accessing it to understand environmental issues, to understand education issues, in some respect, public health issues. You should really make sure, and if possible, apply for a variance for public good. This is social justice, environmental sustainability, equitable resource distribution. Request the fee waiver. All right. Here is some drag and drop language that you can actually put into your request, and this is your fee waiver request language. You just build it into each one of your letters. It says which government agency, the name of your organization, and gives an example of why they should not be charged. There's the actual piece of law that says that you have the right to require a waiver, a fee request waiver. Sorry about that. Processing and timely responses. Federal agencies are required to respond to FOIA requests promptly, but the exact timeliness can vary. Now, again, keep in mind we're talking federal, state, local. Same timeline exists, but what that timeline means could be different. You can request a follow-up to check on the status of your request, ensure timely processing, and disclosure of information in accordance with the guidelines.
After an agency receives your FOIA request, you will usually receive a letter acknowledging the request with an assigned tracking number. If the agency requires additional information before it can begin to process your request, it will contact you. The agency will typically search for records in response to your request and then review them to determine which records or parts of records can be released to you. The agency will redact or black out any information protected from disclosure by one of the FOIA's 9 exemptions. The releasable records will then be sent to you. You should always feel free to contact the agency if you have any questions at all about your request. The agency's FOIA staff are available to explain the FOIA process to you, to provide information about the status of your request, and to assist you in understanding how your request is being handled.
All right, expectations. So you can get all kinds of different files from your FOIA request. The easiest would be digital files, but a lot of times you'll get a call. They say, come to this office, and you will walk into the room, and sitting on a table are boxes or big files, and you just get to open it up and start going through. So understanding and being ready to take those files in a way that doesn't cost you an arm and a leg. I like things like TurboScan. Being able to collect that information in a meaningful way is important.
Once the agency has processed your request and any fee issues have been resolved, the agency will send you a written response, including all the documents that can be released to you. The response letter will advise you whether any information is being withheld because of the exemptions allowed by the FOIA. The letter will also give you an estimate of the amount of material that has been withheld. When a portion of a record has been withheld, typically the page will be marked to let you know what exemptions have been applied. Now, at the same time, the agency will also advise you what you can do if you aren't satisfied with the response.
All right, receiving digital files, it just makes everything easier. If you can get digital files, if you can collect digitally while you are there, as much as you can try not to collect JPEGs of these files, try and save stuff into a PDF immediately, will make your life much easier. Again, oftentimes they're going to ask you to visit a physical location to be able to review all of this stuff. Bringing thumb drives, TurboScan just makes everything so much easier and so much cheaper. All right, now it's time for your quiz. Good luck. Okay, now it's your turn. We're going to go through the process of creating your own FOIA. And in fact, actually, this is a local request going into a county that you could also submit as a FOIA. So, a new apartment complex is slated to be built next to and slightly uphill of your neighborhood. At the local neighborhood association meeting, multiple neighbors note that during rains, red mud is washing from the site into their backyards and streets. It also seems like just a little rain is now causing pooling and a lot more water in the neighborhood. Neighbors have complained, but nothing is getting done. So, there are multiple pieces in that paragraph that you will want to incorporate into your FOIA. First and foremost, you have a new apartment complex. You're going to want to pull the engineering records, any of the permits, any discussions of the permits, and any enforcement actions specifically on the apartment complex. You'll want anything that has to do with stormwater and the stormwater conveyance, because during rains, this is when the red mud and the excess water, so there's two different things happening there. The second is you probably want any erosion and sedimentation information that they have. You want to see the plans. You want to see any of the stormwater infrastructure. In fact, I would actually ask for their stormwater permit. And then the third thing that you have going on here, or the fourth, is actually that neighbors have complained and nothing is getting done. So you want to specifically put in there who has complained and a date and to whom, and see if you can get those files to see if anybody responded, if there was any enforcement action that was taken, if they did a site visit, anything along those lines. So oftentimes people will call 311, for example. Your community might have a 311 or an app where you submit issues. If so, specifically put, caller on June 24th, 2024, contacted 311 with this specific complaint. We would like that record. So your neighborhood group decides to submit an open records request. I want you to work through formulating the letter with a waiver request, right? So this is a neighborhood group. You are working on behalf of the community and individuals beyond yourself that are being impacted. I would submit for a fee waiver. And again, highlight the who, the what, and the where. So you've got 4 different components to build into this one, including specific references on wanting any information about the citizen complaints and what is being done about them. Just to be helpful, here's your example FOIA format. One more time, don't forget to formulate, if you don't have a header, that's fine, but do try to formulate your letter in a correct way, putting your date, how you're submitting it, who you're submitting it to, the what bolded and centered, and then a more specific request of, again, those 4 components and all of the different pieces underneath them. Feel free to pull as much of this language as you would like. And then again, here's your fee waiver request language. Go ahead and pull that directly out, build it into the end of your letter, saying that you're requesting a fee waiver. And then don't forget, if you want to set a specific amount, $25, for example, $5, $100, for them to contact you back before they spend that amount, or if they rise above that amount. All right. Once you have completed that, you should be able to go back to the working documents for this module and find an example of that formulated FOIA for you. Make sure that yours matches, and happy record searching. And now for your quiz. What is the main principle behind the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA? To restrict public access to classified information. B, to grant citizens the right to request government records. Or C, to increase government secrecy during times of crisis. Number 2, when submitting a FOIA request, it is best to be A, vague and broad in your descriptions. B, specific about the information you need. C, primary focused on the why you need the information. Number 3, According to the lesson, what could be a benefit of filing a FOIA request with a fee waiver justification? A. Reducing processing time for your request. B. Increased likelihood of receiving commercially valuable information. C. Getting access to information relevant to the public good at a lower cost. And number 4. Which of the following best describes the reach of FOIA? A. It applies to all levels of government nationwide. B. It applies only to federal agencies with separate laws for state-local levels. Or C. There is no national FOIA law and access to public records varies by state.